The night of March 1st, 2023, in a quiet neighborhood of Brevard County, began peacefully. But around 1:30 a.m., a call came through to the emergency hotline. A frightened man reported that two young boys had called him over a video call pleading for help. Their faces glowed on the phone screen, and behind them was a dark corridor inside the house. What happened within those walls? Why were these children the only ones able to speak of what had occurred? These questions marked the starting point of a story in which family conflicts, systemic failures, and a person soon to be infamous all become tangled. The town of Rockledge in Brevard County, Florida, had been established back in the 19th century and is considered one of the area's older communities. There are no high-rises or huge metropolitan sprawls here, just a typical American suburb where life moves at a steady, predictable pace. In recent decades, Rockledge has grown alongside the nearby space industry, but has retained the character of a quiet place where neighbors know each other and dramatic events are rare. It was in this setting that the Turwilliger family lived. At the heart of the home was Glenda Turwilliger, age 63, whose life revolved around her family. She never sought praise, but it was her support that allowed her daughter to work and not worry constantly about the children. Morning routines, dinners, bedtime talks, these responsibilities rested on her shoulders and became the rhythm of their daily life. Her daughter, Constance Turwilliger, then 35, carried the bulk of the load. She worked to provide for her kids while simultaneously trying to maintain order in the household. Her attention was focused especially on her eldest daughter. With her daughter, she built a relationship based on trust. She didn't dictate, she listened. She gave space for openness. This allowed Kiara Turwilliger to grow not just as a teenager, but as someone who felt heard. Kiara Turwilliger, a 15-year-old girl, was described by friends as outgoing and cheerful, yet carrying a maturity beyond her years. She helped her mother around the house and cared for her younger brothers, shouldering adult responsibilities. Still, Kiara yearned for a normal, stable, and safe life, making plans and supporting her loved ones. Michael Watson, 36, played a pivotal role in this family portrait. He was the father of the two younger boys and the former partner of Constance. Though their relationship had ended, he remained actively involved in his sons' lives. Michael was a steady presence. He helped with the day-to-day from school drop-offs and pickups to checking in with their teachers. He didn't try to take control, but his dependable involvement gave the boys a sense of much-needed stability and routine. In Rockledge, this was a family with modest goals. Their dreams weren't grand, just to maintain a steady income, give the kids a decent education, and raise them in an environment built on trust and support. It was a life rooted in the hope that tomorrow would look like today, that nothing would disturb the peace they'd managed to create. The Turwilliger brothers, ages 6 and 9, were growing up in a world shaped by care and safety, a world built by the adults around them. Their childhood was simple, filled with school days, playtime, and the small, comforting routines of everyday life. The older son was already beginning to take on small responsibilities, while the younger followed his lead with wide-eyed curiosity. Their home wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a space that held the warmth of familiar voices and the comfort of family. At the center of their lives was their mother. Her authority and sense of direction gave the boys a strong foundation. They were used to her voice, her structured routines, and her ability to keep the household running. Her presence made things feel certain, like no matter what happened, she'd know what to do. Their grandmother, Glenda Turwilliger, was just as essential. She was the one they turned to when Mom was busy. With Glenda, the boys felt calm. She didn't argue or raise her voice. She simply guided them gently but firmly, keeping them on track. Kiara was more than just a sister to them. She was a guide. She helped them navigate the confusing emotions of growing up, giving them advice on how to handle school, how to talk to friends, how to deal with the little bumps in life. Her care wasn't parental. It was the kind of genuine support that only comes from someone who knows you, who listens, and who never judges. The boys trusted her completely. Their father, Michael Watson, was a constant figure in his own way. He was there when it mattered, offering help, staying in touch. He wasn't a memory of the past. He was a real part of their present. His calm and steady presence reassured them that even though their parents had separated, he was still there. He hadn't gone anywhere. These deep family bonds gave the Turwilliger boys a real sense of safety and structure. But they were the ones who would ultimately witness an unthinkable tragedy. The only survivors and the only ones left who could speak of what happened that night. Dominico Gigante, Kiara's biological father, came back into her life after years of complete absence. He hadn't been around while she was growing up. He didn't support the family, didn't help raise her, and had no meaningful presence during her early years. When he resurfaced during her teenage years, he said he wanted to make things right and become a real father. His efforts to reconnect, the phone calls, messages, offers to help with school, sounded conciliatory, but his sudden reappearance disrupted a life that already had clearly defined roles, boundaries, and a delicate balance. Constance Turwilliger approached his return with caution. She understood the emotional weight of biological ties, but also recognized the risk of someone who'd never proven themselves suddenly pushing their way back in. She agreed to let him speak with Kiara, but under strict conditions. All contact had to go through her. No pressure on their daughter, and no surprise visits. These weren't meant to cut him off completely. They were meant to protect a teenager who didn't know this man as dad. Constance established the ground rules and made sure they were followed closely. For Kiara, this unexpected re-entry into her life was unsettling. She'd grown up in a family built on trust, surrounded by people she knew and leaned on. This new person, calling himself her father, didn't share her past. There were no childhood memories, no foundation. Kiara wasn't rude, but she kept her distance. She gave short replies, postponed visits, and chose to communicate through her mother. It wasn't rebellion. It was self-protection, a way to hold on to her emotional space. The warning signs came quickly. Dominico began calling more often than necessary, asking questions that crossed boundaries. Where she was, who she was with, when she'd be home. He demanded specific details about her schedule and grew possessive over her time. The family had hoped for a slow, respectful reconnection, but this wasn't that. Things escalated when Dominico started flooding her messages late at night, demanding instant replies and expressing frustration when she didn't respond quickly enough. He pressured her to move their conversations off shared platforms and away from her mother's oversight. Kiara noticed that the more she tried to set boundaries, the more insistent he became. This wasn't miscommunication. It was a deliberate attempt to gain control. The turning point came when Dominico crossed a clear and unacceptable line. He asked Kiara to send photos of herself in a swimsuit. That request left no room for doubt. Kiara immediately told her mother. Constance Turwilliger acted swiftly. She confronted Domenico directly and laid down strict, non-negotiable boundaries. All communication had to be open, monitored, and in no way private or suggestive. No meetings without her presence. No exceptions. Domenico's reaction revealed how he saw boundaries, not as something to respect, but as obstacles to push through. He argued against the conditions, insisted he had a right to closeness, and tried to bypass the agreed-upon rules by contacting Kiara directly. His messages turned accusatory. He claimed Constance was turning Kiara against him, distorting their relationship. But what he failed to understand was simple. Trust isn't declared. It's earned over time with consistent actions. For Kiara Turwilliger, this marked a defining moment. She became more firm in her decision to keep her distance, to avoid any meetings without her mother present, and to stand up against any attempt at control or manipulation. She shared every inappropriate message or incident with her family, asking them for support in keeping him at a distance. Before the tragedy struck, law enforcement already had records on Dominico Gigante. His first serious run-in with the law happened in 2005 when he was arrested for domestic violence. The victim reported being physically harmed, and the investigation documented injuries consistent with the accusations. Instead of prison time, he was offered a pretrial diversion program, counseling, supervision, and no criminal conviction if completed successfully. After finishing the program, the case was closed. It was the first time a real threat to others had been downplayed. By 2008, his behavior had become even more disturbing. He was involved in a case of animal cruelty that led to the deaths of 2 dogs. The investigation uncovered horrifying details, and the county sheriff at the time called it one of the most appalling cases he'd ever seen. A prison sentence seemed inevitable, but once again, the punishment fell short. 2 years of house arrest and probation. Clear signs of escalating violence were brushed aside. House arrest, by definition, places some limits on a person's freedom. But it's not the same as being incarcerated. It allows the person to remain in their home, maintain daily routines, and experience only minimal disruption compared to jail time. For Dominico Gigante, it meant the seriousness of the charges never brought real consequences, and instead of reform, it reinforced the belief that with the right legal moves, aggression and violent behavior could be excused. In 2012, another disturbing chapter unfolded. This time, it was road rage. Witnesses reported that Dominico Gigante was driving his pickup recklessly, deliberately creating dangerous situations for cars and motorcyclists. The incident ended with a collision involving 2 bikers. When he was followed to a friend's house, Dominico emerged holding a machete and continued making threats. Despite facing charges for assault with a deadly weapon and reckless endangerment, which could have led to serious consequences for his behavior behind the wheel and for brandishing a weapon, several of those charges were ultimately dropped. Once again, he avoided prison time. Instead, he received another 2 years of house arrest and supervision. The core issue was never addressed. There was no long-term intervention to deal with the root causes of his escalating behavior. The system focused on check-ins, mandatory courses, and surface-level monitoring. Meanwhile, Domenico's actions shifted from controlling behavior in private to public displays of intimidation. Every lenient decision only reinforced the belief that the system would continue to give him another chance. That isolation wasn't necessary if he said the right things. By the early 2020s, his track record painted a troubling picture. A pattern of violent tendencies, disregard for legal boundaries, and a readiness to use threats and weapons to assert power. But instead of tightening restrictions, the system continued to offer short-term fixes, avoiding the hard questions. That's how a dark file takes shape. A growing stack of red flags that never lead to real consequences. On February 27th, Kiara Turwilliger came down with a case of tonsillitis and stayed home from school. She had a doctor's appointment scheduled. Domenico used the situation to intensify his attempts to reach out, asking persistent questions that went far beyond normal concern. He wanted specifics about her doctor visit, what the doctor would say, when the appointment was, and who would be with her. His so-called concern was paired with demands for exact information, violating the agreement that all updates about Kiara's well-being would go through her mother. On February 28th, around 3 p.m., Domenico called again. Kiara was busy at the optometrist's office and gave a brief response saying she'd get back to him later. What followed was a harsh, offensive message. After that, Kiara limited their contact to only what was absolutely necessary for Constance Turwilliger. It was the final confirmation. The man claiming to want a relationship with his daughter was now using verbal aggression and manipulation. The hostility toward the family wasn't triggered by a lack of communication. It was caused by their refusal to allow their boundaries to be violated. Domenico saw control as his right and treated any limit on that control as a personal attack. It became clear this was no longer a case of strained family dynamics. It had evolved into a direct and dangerous threat. The family's efforts to create a safe space for Kiara had become the very thing that pushed Domenico toward confrontation. Bruce McInnes had lived under the same roof as Dominico Gigante for nearly 18 years. He knew his routines, his moods, and the ways he dealt with stress. So when Gigante's behavior began to shift in late February of 2023, Bruce noticed right away. Pacing around the house, muttering to himself, obsessively checking his phone. Everything revolved around one name, Kiara Turwilliger. On February 28th, after yet another failed attempt to reach Kiara, Domenico sent a harsh message. Bruce heard him read it aloud, followed by a string of insults aimed at her family. Then suddenly, the anger gave way to a chilling silence. What Domenico said next wasn't shouted or emotional. It was calm. Matter of fact, guess I'll have to go take them all out. Bruce froze. This wasn't a heated outburst or a threat said in passing. It was deliberate. It was a plan. From that moment on, the warning signs came fast and clear. Domenico repeated himself. No one's listening to me. They turned her against me. Something has to be done. He stopped using names and began saying them, which made Bruce wonder if Domenico was thinking beyond just Kiara. The silence between those statements was filled with restless pacing and rereading old messages. Domenico wasn't trying to cool off. He was spiraling. So why didn't Bruce go to the authorities? He would later say he'd grown used to that kind of talk. Over the years, he'd heard Gigante make bold, angry statements that eventually fizzled out. This felt like more of the same, just noise, And then there were the doubts. What exactly would he report? Who should he warn? Would calling someone trigger an even worse reaction at home? Bruce decided to wait it out. That evening, Gigante kept saying the same things. She's not answering. They're in the way. This has to end. Bruce tried to get him to focus on something else. Go out, run an errand, take a break from the tension. Domenico wasn't interested. He didn't ask for advice. He didn't need convincing. He had made up his mind. Only in hindsight did Bruce piece it all together. The short statements, the intensity, the stillness. It was all leading towards something far worse than just words. It's important to note, Bruce McInnes never documented the threats, never shared them with anyone. His only response was an attempt to de-escalate things through conversation. Later, he admitted, I didn't think it would go further than just talk, but it did. And with that missed moment came a tragic truth, that by the end of February, a man with a known history of violence was openly talking about his intentions in front of another adult, and no one alerted the authorities. The threats remained just words until the night they weren't. By the end of February 2023, any trace of civility in Dominico Gigante's tone had vanished. The pretense of reconciliation gave way to something far more chilling, a clear and growing intent to threaten. He stopped asking for meetings involving Kiara's mother. He no longer discussed boundaries. His focus shifted completely toward removing what he now viewed as an obstacle. Signs of planning began to appear. Domenico started asking specific questions about Kiara's daily routine, where she would be, who she would be with, and what time she'd be home. This wasn't conversation. It was data collection, a blueprint. Constance Turwilliger remained firm. Any communication with Kiara had to go through her and had to be trackable. That position, steady and unwavering, made her the primary focus of Domenico's anger. He began accusing her of manipulating their daughter, and his hostility toward the family as a whole escalated quickly. By the evening of February 28th, all the elements of what would soon become a nightmare were in place. He had rejected any third-party involvement, targeted a time of night when the house would be most vulnerable, and made it clear, if only to himself, that he was prepared to act alone. No warnings, no witnesses, just intent. Around 1:20 a.m. on March 1st, 2023, the Turwilliger household was asleep. The silence was shattered, first by screaming, then by a rapid series of gunshots, 9 in total. In between, terrified voices could be heard. Then a sudden chilling quiet. The 2 young boys woke to the sound of chaos. They stepped out of their room and were met with the aftermath. The older brother grabbed Kiara's phone, opened a video call, and reached out to someone he trusted, a family acquaintance, Michael Bishan. He had expected to see Kiara's face on the screen. Instead, he saw 2 frightened boys trying to describe something unimaginable. Michael Bishan reacted instantly. He stayed on the call, speaking calmly, urging the boys to stay put, to remain in the room, and not move until he arrived. While driving over, he confirmed their address, checking in repeatedly to hear their voices, just enough to know they were still okay. When he arrived, the call was still active. Entering the home, Bishan immediately encountered a horrifying scene. Near the entryway were 2 adults, unresponsive, Constance Turwilliger and Michael Watson. Without hesitating, he went straight upstairs to the children. He gathered them, brought them down carefully, and got them into his car, shielding them from seeing any more than they already had. He locked the doors from the inside, checked that the boys were safe and close by, and only then did he make the emergency call to the rescue services. While speaking with the emergency dispatcher, Michael Bishon reported that he had received a video call from a child, arrived at the Turwilliger home, and found multiple unresponsive adults inside. He clarified that the two young boys were safe and with him in his vehicle, and that urgent help was needed immediately. He didn't attempt to assess the condition of the victims further. Time was critical, and he had no intention of re-entering the home. The first patrol units arrived shortly after 2 a.m. Headlights cut through the dark as law enforcement blocked the street and secured the perimeter. Emergency responders quickly took over. Police, paramedics, and a forensic response team. The street was silent except for the flicker of emergency lights. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes only after the siren stopped. The boys were kept warm in a patrol vehicle where a medic and a specialist trained in handling child witnesses provided immediate care. In that moment, their role became central. Their call had triggered the response that prevented the situation from getting worse. Investigators began their sweep of the scene. The front door showed clear signs of forced entry, a broken lock, and splintered doorframe. On the ground floor, 9 spent shell casings were recovered. Their placement and ballistic paths were carefully marked and logged. The absence of signs of prolonged struggle, along with valuables, left untouched, ruled out robbery. This was a targeted attack on the residents. Medical personnel confirmed the fatalities. The initial police assessment recorded gunshot wounds to the heads of Constance Turwilliger and Michael Watson near the entryway. Upstairs, Glenda Turwilliger was found in bed with a gunshot wound to the face. Kiara was discovered separately, her location noted for evidence integrity. The home was divided into zones, and every movement of the investigative team was documented to maintain the chain of custody. At the same time, officers canvassed the neighborhood and began collecting footage from residential and street cameras. Several neighbors pointed to home surveillance systems. Footage from a nearby camera showed a pickup truck pulling into the Turwilliger driveway at 1:19 a.m. Its headlights shut off moments before it came to a stop. The sound of the door being forced open, and 9 shots followed over the next 71 seconds. Moments later, the truck pulled away. A different camera on a neighboring street picked up what appeared to be the same silver pickup heading toward the area where Dominico Gigante lived. The forensic team compared the video timeline with physical evidence from the scene. The number of shell casings matched the audio. Bloody shoe prints were documented at the entrance and along the staircase, the pattern suggesting a fast direct movement through the home. Timestamps from all footage were synced with dispatcher logs to eliminate any discrepancies from time zone settings or device clocks. Phones and digital devices were collected from the scene, including the one belonging to Kiara Turwilliger. Call logs and messages were copied to secure storage, with access strictly limited and officially documented. These digital records became crucial in establishing a timeline of the escalation of pressure, the final exchanges, and Kiara's abrupt decision to cut off communication. By midday, investigators had assembled a compelling body of evidence. There was clear forced entry, targeted acts of violence against specific family members, no signs of robbery, synchronized video footage of a silver pickup truck, and a digital trail showing threats and coercion. At the top of the suspect list was Dominico Gigante. He had motive, access to personal schedules, and a history of escalating conflict with the family. On the morning of March 1st, investigators approached Dominico Gigante using the knock-and-talk method, which does not require a warrant. Parked in front of his residence was a silver pickup matching the description of the vehicle seen on surveillance footage outside the Turwilliger home. When Dominico stepped outside with Bruce McInnes, officers informed him that Kiara Turwilliger was deceased. His reaction: "This is a joke. That can't be true." He didn't ask what happened or request to see his daughter. Showing no visible emotion, he asked for a cigarette and mentioned needing to gather himself because of the dogs. Detectives invited him to come down to the station for a conversation. He agreed without hesitation, but also without expressing any concern about the events. On the ride to the station, he didn't ask about Kiara, didn't mention the family, and instead made small talk. Officers noted the lack of any parent-focused questions or meaningful response to the fact that his daughter had been killed. Before leaving, Bruce McInnes reportedly asked Dominico directly if he had anything to do with what had happened. Dominico responded, "Yeah, I shot her 3 times. Now it's just us. We stick together. We'll get through it." There was no remorse in his voice, no explanation, no regret, just a strange, almost detached attempt to draw McInnes into his mindset. At the station, during his initial interview, Dominico remained emotionally flat. He didn't request that anyone be contacted on his behalf and showed no interest in the investigation. When asked direct questions, he gave vague answers and repeatedly returned to off-topic subjects. The official report notes a complete lack of natural parental response to the death of a child. What followed was an attempt to shift the blame. While in custody, Dominico Gigante requested a monitored meeting with Bruce McInnes, during which he proposed a so-called solution that Bruce take the fall for the sake of their friendship. He tried to frame it as a noble act, something that would save them both if Bruce would just go along with his version of events. Bruce refused. Later, he informed investigators of the conversation, quoting Dominico's words exactly. Days later, in a recorded jail phone call, Dominico repeated the same idea. He urged Bruce to confess in his place and brought up the possibility of pleading insanity. These calls, all logged per standard protocol, were added to the case as further evidence of ongoing witness manipulation and attempts to rewrite the narrative. The trial of Dominico Gigante opened with a question of mental competency. His defense argued that he had acted under the influence of a psychological disorder, that he wasn't in control, and didn't fully understand the consequences of his actions. They called for further psychiatric evaluations and referenced his prior history of aggressive outbursts. The defense's primary objective was to have Gigante declared not criminally responsible by reason of insanity, effectively removing the charge of premeditated murder. But the prosecution countered immediately. From the first hearing, they presented the case as a cold, calculated act, not a moment of madness, but a meticulously planned attack. Throughout the trial, Gigante sat silently. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge the jury, and showed no visible reaction when the victims' names were read aloud. Jurors interpreted his demeanor as total lack of remorse. The prosecutor's final statement proved decisive. He laid out the timeline step by step, detailing each action from the buildup of threats to the execution of the plan. According to the prosecution, everything pointed to one conclusion. This was not a spontaneous act. It was intentional from the start. In closing arguments, The defense reiterated the mental health angle, but court-appointed experts testified that while Gigante did show signs of a personality disorder, it did not impair his ability to understand the nature and consequences of his actions. After just a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge handed down the sentence, 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, a sentence structured to ensure that Dominico Gigante would never walk free again. As the verdict was read, Dominico Gigante remained completely emotionless. He didn't make a statement. He didn't look at the courtroom. Not a flicker of reaction crossed his face. For the family members present who stood to hear the judge's final words, it was a solemn confirmation that justice had been served. Even though no verdict could bring back the lives that were lost, the sentencing brought legal closure. The state officially declared Dominico Gigante guilty of a premeditated mass killing and eliminated any possibility of his release. The 2 young boys were placed in the care of extended family. Custody arrangements were handled through state agencies with involvement from child protection professionals. To shield them from further trauma and unwanted public attention, the boys were relocated to a different undisclosed location. Their immediate needs became the top priority, ensuring safety, creating a stable daily routine, accessing necessary medical care, and continuing their education. As the only witnesses to the tragedy, the children were interviewed with extreme care, following protocols specifically designed for minors. Trained specialists conducted the sessions gently and methodically, recording vital information without re-traumatizing the boys. All contact with the outside world, including media inquiries, was strictly managed through legal guardians to protect the children from public scrutiny and pressure. This tragedy exposed long-standing failures in the system. Time and again, Dominico Gigante had managed to avoid real consequences. His early acts of violence were treated as isolated incidents, not as parts of a larger dangerous pattern. The link between cruelty to animals and future harm to people was overlooked. The red flags were there, but no one connected them. For the boys, life after this event isn't a headline. It's a long, painful process of rebuilding. They'll have to relearn how to trust adults, adapt to a new way of living, and find stability in a world that once felt safe and suddenly wasn't. The memory of Glenda, Constance, Kiara Turwilliger, and Michael Watson will always be a part of their story. And the responsibility to learn, to change, to act, rests with the adults, the ones who design the systems, the ones who decide whether the warning signs are taken seriously next time, whether the right words spoken in time might finally be heard. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon so you can be the first to hear about such real-life stories.